The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
If anyone has the goods on Donald Trump, it's his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. I've said this before. Cohen's been convicted. Cohen is heading to prison for what is, as of now, scheduled to be a 3-year term that is set to start in the first 8 or 9 days or so of March. And he was going to testify publicly before a House committee in just about a couple of weeks on February 7th. And we've been anxiously awaiting this testimony. I want to hear from Michael Cohen because we could hear all sorts of potentially huge and relevant statements made by him. But that testimony has unfortunately been postponed by Michael Cohen indefinitely, which to me means canceled. When someone says something is postponed indefinitely, I'm hearing that it's canceled. And he says the reason why is because of the threats from President Trump and from President Trump's TV attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and how his family, particularly his father-in-law and his wife, are now very, very much afraid as a result of the threats that have been issued. So the Rudy Giuliani piece is getting to be a bigger and bigger factor in everything that's going on in the media circus right now, and we're going to sort of focus in on that a little bit later. But for now, let's keep it focused on the Cohen allegations. We got a statement from longtime Clinton friend and Michael Cohen's attorney. Remember, MAGA is making attorneys get attorneys. Lanny Davis put out a statement about this decision saying, quote, due to ongoing threats against his family from President Trump and Mr. Giuliani as recently as this weekend, as well as Mr. Cohen's continued cooperation with ongoing investigations, by advice of counsel, Mr. Cohen's appearance will be postponed to a later date. Mr. Cohen wishes to thank Chairman Cummings for allowing him to appear before the House Oversight Committee and looks forward to testifying at the appropriate time. This is a time where Mr. Cohen had to put his family and their safety first. So now, we'll get to the threats in a second. House Democrats now have a decision to make. They could say, okay, we're just not going to hear from Michael Cohen for the time being. Or they could subpoena Michael Cohen to force him to be there. And some Democrats have already said they fully expect Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings to indeed issue a subpoena and to get Michael Cohen there before his early March report to prison date. We'll see if that happens, but let's go through a few other elements of this. First of all, what threats are they alleging Trump and Giuliani made? Because there's two sides to this. Publicly, Donald Trump has started talking about Michael Cohen's father-in-law, intimating that he may be a criminal, that he may be sort of a mob-type guy. You then had Rudy Giuliani answer questions about whether it's appropriate for Donald Trump to be doing that, for whether it's appropriate for the president to be suggesting the family members of someone involved in an investigation like this be targeted for possible criminal wrongdoing, although that's all it is at this point. Rudy Giuliani said, well, if they're criminals, then it is completely and totally appropriate. So that may be the full extent of the threats that Michael Cohen is referring to, which are already very, very bad. I mean, even that is completely out of this world for a president who is under an investigation that is unprecedented, other than maybe what we saw happen during Richard Nixon's presidency, start to imply that Michael Cohen had better be careful about what he says, because next thing you know, his father-in-law might be under investigation. So that is all already outrageous. Then the question is, have there also been private threats made? Have there been private threats communicated to Michael Cohen? Because if Rudy Giuliani already says it's possible Trump spoke to Cohen about the testimony as some kind of general thing, of course, denying that any kind of direction to lie was made, it's certainly conceivable that during that same conversation, there could have been implicit or explicit threats made as well. Remember that it is very, very likely that even if Cohen did testify, he wouldn't testify publicly about any of the real bombshells that we don't yet know about. So maybe what happened here, Pat, is that Michael Cohen calculated that the upside to this public testimony is just not that big compared to the negative attention and the risks. And I don't know about you, Pat, but if I were in his position, I would be wondering the same thing. How much can I really say in this testimony? And the last thing I want is my wife's dad to end up under investigation here.
Well, President Trump says that Michael Cohen has only been threatened with the truth, which seems to give a little bit of credence to this whole thing. The only thing that gives me pause about this story is how involved Rudy Giuliani is. Like, we know Giuliani to be Trump's TV lawyer. He's not representing him in court. He just kind of goes out there on these cable shows and beta tests these different defenses of Trump. So I'd kind of be surprised to hear that he was directly influencing Trump's enemies and trying to threaten them.
Yeah, I think the most likely scenario is that what he's referring to when he talks about Rudy Giuliani is Giuliani on TV simply saying, no, I don't think there's anything that crazy about Trump, suggesting maybe that there should be an investigation into Cohen's father-in-law. And it's possible that Trump and Giuliani have been putting pressure on Cohen in some other ways that don't constitute threats, and that then that combined with the public statements just kind of rose to a level where Cohen said he's bailing. And then the legal question is, would any of that, including what was said publicly by Trump and Giuliani, is that witness intimidation, witness tampering? Is it possible obstruction of justice? Those would be crimes. And the trend here is by Trump. It's been the same trend for a long time, which is obstruct any way that you can, influence witnesses any way that you can, behave like the mob guy he sort of is implying Michael Cohen's father-in-law is. We don't yet have confirmation of direct threats beyond what was said publicly, but this is all part and parcel of this long-term trend of criminal mobster behavior that we've come to see and expect from Donald Trump. And then we really have to talk about what's going on with Rudy Giuliani, even above and beyond this particular story. And that's where I want to go next. There's something that is being widely reported about Rudy Giuliani, which would simultaneously sort of be the most sensible explanation as to what's going on, but also very, very sad. Let me set it up for you. So we've been talking for a while now about how Rudy Giuliani's television appearances to defend President Trump are legally incoherent. But they don't really need to be legally coherent because Rudy Giuliani is Trump's lawyer only in the most general sense. He's not making legal statements for Donald Trump on television. So when Giuliani says there were no mistress payments, but then says there were and Trump didn't know about them and wasn't involved in them, and then says actually Trump did know about them and was involved in them, but it's fine, it's completely legal. Or when Giuliani says, I've heard the tapes, and then says there are no tapes. Or when Giuliani says there was no collusion, and later he denies ever having said that there was no collusion. Legally, it's of limited importance, according to most legal experts. But it's very strange. So we've been speculating that maybe this is some kind of calculated 4D chess strategy. You put out conflicting stories, you make it impossible to even know what it is Giuliani is claiming are the facts. It's possible that it's just incompetence on Rudy Giuliani's behalf. But now it's being reported that the explanation might be way simpler than this, and it's called alcohol. It's called drinking. There's a number of Trump allies who are now saying that there is huge concern at the White House about Giuliani's strange television appearances, and that they believe at least part of the problem is that Rudy's going on TV after drinking. And I guess by this it follows logically, drinking enough for the drinking to affect what he says and how he says it on television. There are 3 White House officials and Republicans close to the White House, none of whom are authorized to speak publicly about this for obvious reasons, who are telling the same story, which is that, number one, Trump is frustrated that Rudy Giuliani really messed up the recent rebuttals to the BuzzFeed News Robert Mueller controversy. No one is suggesting that Trump is thinking about firing Rudy Giuliani, at least at this point. But what keeps coming up is this topic of alcohol. And it appears that allies of Trump are suggesting Rudy shouldn't be allowed on TV at night. Like, this is actually a discussion that Rudy Giuliani can keep doing TV appearances, but they shouldn't happen at night because he's going on TV after drinking. And 3 different sources have said this at this point. And the entire thing reminds me of when former Trump aide, remember Sam Nunberg? He went on TV and his behavior was extraordinarily erratic. And at one point, CNN's Aaron Burnett smelled alcohol on his breath. Remember this insane moment on CNN?
Talked earlier about what people in the White House were saying about you.
Yeah.
Talking about whether you were drinking or on drugs or whatever they had happened today. Talking to you,
Yeah.
I have smelled alcohol on your breath.
Well, I have not had a drink.
You haven't had a drink, so that's not.
No.
So I just, because it is the talk out there, again, I know it's awkward, let me just give you the questions. You can categorically answer them. No, you have had a drink today?
My answer is no. I have not.
Anything else?
No.
No.
No. Besides my meds.
Okay.
Antidepressants, is that okay?
No, I mean, I'm just trying to understand.
Well, look. They
what
can say
happened today.
I'd love to see that question put to Rudy Giuliani, and it actually has come up before. Back in May, he was asked about his drinking by Politico, and he said he sometimes likes to have a drink with dinner, that he likes drinking when he smokes cigars. And actually, alcohol is the most reasonable explanation to explain why Rudy Giuliani one day this week quoted Donald Trump, and then the next day called it a hypothetical quote that didn't actually exist. All the other explanations that point to incompetence or some kind of advanced strategy or cognitive decline or whatever, drinking alcohol actually doesn't require any of that speculation. And in a sense, it's the simplest explanation of all. What do you think is behind his weird behavior? Alcohol, a strategy of sorts, incompetence, confusion? Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Kevin Louillier. Kevin, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member, supporting independent media that you care about, that you think is worthy of your support. Brian Wright has been a member for almost 5 years, and he's today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Kevin, Brian, thank you. Membership costs just about a penny and a half for each video that we put out, or about 30 cents for each hour podcast that we put out. It's really cheap, okay? So if you can afford it, if you have the means, please consider going to joinpakman.com, signing up, and if you want a really great discount, get on our newsletter by signing up at davidpakman.com. And on February 2nd, on my birthday, you will get an email with a very, very special, just monstrous, absolutely big league membership special, which I look forward to being a catalyst for massive influxes of member support. Okay, I hope that you've checked out the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit, where political discussion is happening among more than 8,000 of our viewers and listeners. A couple of interesting stories I spotted this morning on the David Pakman Show subreddit. One pointing out that the public perception of Medicare for all shifts drastically on the basis of how it's presented. So depending, and I've mentioned this before, depending on what you call Medicare for all, depending on how you explain how it would work, you can either get huge support for Medicare for all or huge opposition to Medicare for all. This is a study from the Kaiser Family Foundation. That we have on screen. I won't give you all of the details, but I've pointed this out before. If you actually ask people on the merits, do they support Medicare for all? Overwhelmingly, they do. If you say things like, would you support Medicare for all if it required most Americans to pay more taxes, you get opposition, of course, ignoring the fact that in total you would still save money because you don't have health care premiums and co-pays and all sorts of other stuff. So very, very good post on the subreddit. Also from the subreddit, Pakman says, Bernie bros hate my show. Someone asking, what did I mean when I said Bernie bros hate my show? And I had to clarify what I mean was that what I meant was that back in 2016, I supported Bernie in the primaries. And when he didn't win, and yes, I don't believe it was a fair fight, but ultimately he was not the nominee, and me pretending that he wasn't going to change reality. I said, I'm voting for Hillary. I'm not voting for Trump. And there were some Bernier busters who were very angry with me for taking that position. So it doesn't have anything to do with 2020 thus far. Bernie has not announced a run for 2020. That's all I meant. That's why so-called Bernie bros were mad at me 3 years ago at this point. Lastly, from the David Pakman Show subreddit, a pre-hate thread for no show on 2020's Martin Luther King Day. I mentioned that even though we did a show this year on Martin Luther King Day because of how the holidays lined up, next year we will probably go back to staff having the federal holiday off. And people already complaining that next year we're not doing a show on Martin Luther King Day. You just can't please everybody, Pat. If we do a show on Martin Luther King Day, some people are mad that we aren't taking staff breaks and that I am a slave driver forcing people to come in on a holiday. If we do take Martin Luther King Day off, we get emails from people saying that they're mad and we should be doing a show about Martin Luther King. You can't please everybody.
I think it's a little bit premature to start talking about Martin Luther King Day 2020. Remember, we have President's Day coming up next month. I'm not sure if we're going to take that one off, but I assure you, if we do take it off, we're going to get some heat for it.
Yeah, for everybody who's already mad about 2020 Martin Luther King Day, focus your energy on being mad about whatever we decide to do on President's Day. And by the way, we should talk about that, Pat. I don't remember how I've marked that on the show calendar, but we'll talk about that later. And we'll cut out this entire segment from the broadcast show. Join the discussion at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Okay, there's a very tense situation developing in Venezuela, which I have to cover, which I've been looking forward to covering, and which a lot of people are going to be extraordinarily angry with me for covering in the way that I'm about to cover it. But that's okay. I do the stories the way I see them, period, full stop. Nothing else needs to be added to that. Okay, this relates to Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and a guy named Juan Guaidó. The headline from the last 24 hours is that Venezuelan opposition leader and president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, has declared himself interim president of Venezuela after rejecting the election results in a coalition with some other Venezuelan political higher-ups, which saw Nicolas Maduro reelected. Strongman, authoritarian Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro was recently reelected, but was reelected after effectively rigging the election. And so Guaidó claims that according to the Constitution, he can be appointed interim president until there are new elections, which will presumably be more fair, or would ideally be more fair at some point in the future. And the idea is that this interim president is supposed to oversee the creation of a transitional legislative body to organize and run those eventual fair elections. What do we know about the recent, quote, re-election of Nicolas Maduro? Well, we know that in the midst of riots and economic collapse, Maduro's approval rating was in the toilet. So what he did was to start efforts to maintain control over the country. That included repressing a movement to have a recall election, which was canceled despite 70% approval for that recall. Eventually, though, Maduro was up for re-election anyway, and that's what we eventually got. We got that election. Maduro won by cheating. He banned opponents from running against him with various charges. He moved polling stations around in areas where he had significant opposition. That's a tactic that should remind us all of what Republicans try to do in the United States with voter suppression. He started to imply that people who don't vote for him might lose their rations, which in a country that has so much hunger, not enough money, not enough supplies and basic provisions for food, that's a major threat to be making either implicitly or explicitly. And he ended up, after all of this, with, quote, 68% of the vote, which is very difficult for anybody who's even remotely informed to believe. It wasn't just the opposition in Venezuela that questioned the results. The European Union rejected the election. The United Nations rejected the election. Numerous American allies around the world rejected to recognize this as a legitimate election. And the United States has now recognized Guaidó as a legitimate interim president. Argentinian right-wing President Macri has also done the same. And in retaliation, Maduro has officially cut off ties with the United States. Venezuela is going to kick out American diplomats. They're going to try to continue the authoritarian rule. And that's where we get to the analysis of the situation. Here's the problem that I'm going to have with part of the left in the United States. There's this, call it what you want, I sometimes call it the Leninist left. The Leninist left likes to act like Maduro is the progressive, when in reality, he has progressive-sounding populist rhetoric, but his tactics and his rule is exactly that of authoritarians in different parts of the world, and in many ways overlaps with American Republican authoritarian ideas. There are geopolitical reasons and so-called communist fear, which tell us a lot about why people like Trump and Macri oppose Nicolas Maduro. But when you actually sit down for a second and say, okay, let me ignore whether Erdogan or Macron or Trump or Macri support or oppose Maduro, let's look at what he does. Let's examine the populist rhetoric that is actually a guy's veiling, it's thinly veiled authoritarian strongman policy, voter suppression, almost identical in many ways to what Republicans do, antipathy towards the media and courts that is so reminiscent of Donald Trump, although he goes much further, election results that are about as believable as Kim Jong-un got 100% of the vote, and thinking of that as a representation of the North Korean perspective on Kim Jong-un, or Putin received whatever percent of the vote it was that he supposedly received. And case in point, start to take a look at who congratulated Maduro on his win. Lots of Donald Trump's authoritarian crushes, as we like to call them. China, North Korea, Russia, Syria, Turkey. This is where Trump has been sort of smitten, right? Trump's smitten with the Chinese president for making it possible to be president indefinitely if he continues to be reelected. Kim Jong-un, his sense of humor, and he's such a smart guy. Putin, what do I even have to say about Putin? Tacitly Bashar al-Assad, impressed with some of President Erdogan's authoritarian actions. That's the list of people who are supportive of the win by Nicolas Maduro. So you might be saying, hold on, David, that's sort of ad hominem, saying that we either should be for or against Maduro based on who else is for or against him. No, no, no. What I'm telling you is the opposite. If you are skeptical of opposition to Maduro because Trump says that he supports the interim president, then how can you simultaneously apply that ad hominem logic when I mention all of the other authoritarians around the world who are defending Nicolas Maduro? Either we are going to evaluate Nicolas Maduro on the facts, on his actions, or we are going to take into consideration all world leaders who both favor or oppose him. You can't have it both ways. We were already seeing the Leninist left frame this as a right-wing, U.S.-backed, astroturf forced regime change, and they'll point to the fact that Trump is supportive of the interim president. But at a certain point, we've got to distinguish the logic from the ad hominems, right? I mean, Hitler liked dogs, and I like dogs. What does that actually tell us about any particular policy or other world leader on which we might have opinions? You know, Kim Jong-un breathes air, and other humans breathe air. To say that there's any way to take that and analyze policy doesn't make sense, and I think we need to apply the same critical thinking here. I am a progressive. I'm against strongman dictators. I'm against people who subjugate the basic institutions of democracy, so I'm opposed to Nicolas Maduro, period. As far as what will happen next, it may end up coming down to where the Venezuelan military falls on this, because in these situations, the person with the support of the military often ends up winning the political battle. And right now, there's every indication that the military is mostly behind Nicolas Maduro, including on the basis of a speech that top military officials gave this morning, flanked by huge pictures of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. That could change. But if the military remains united behind Maduro, he will likely be able to retain power. You should expect massive repression of protesters by the military, including violence, including tear gas and rubber bullets. They're not going to allow it any more than they absolutely have to or can't control. And I was speaking actually this morning to some Venezuelan refugees, I think is the right term, who are living in my home country of Argentina, which, by the way, is no paradise right now, okay? No shortage of massive, massive economic problems in Argentina, but at least it's not what's taking place in Venezuela. They believe it is going to get very, very ugly, and even though they were hoping to return to their home country of Venezuela sooner than later, it is they are realizing that they probably have to settle in for quite some time in Argentina, because it is going to, in all likelihood, get very ugly for a pretty long period of time in Venezuela. Send me your thoughts about the situation there. I'm on Instagram at david.pakman. The show is on Instagram at David Pakman Show. After the break, I will interview Francois Margolin, who has a very interesting new documentary where he interviews jihadists in Mali. He joins me after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's a pleasure to be joined today by Francois Margolin, who is a French documentarian whose latest film, Jihadists, builds on his decades of experience traveling and filming in the Middle East and in Afghanistan and Northern Africa. Francois, I've had a chance to view the film, and it is extraordinarily interesting. And I think maybe a place to start would be, what's the thesis? What's the idea of this film? What are you hoping to show people?
The idea of the film was to demonstrate that the people that we call terrorists, who make a terror attack in Paris, in United States, in Syria, in Iraq, everywhere, they are not fool. They are not crazy. They have an ideology. And it was important for me to understand what is this ideology. I'm working on the subject since 25 years. I was the only one to make a film about the Taliban in Afghanistan 1 year before September 11. And I know these people. I know that they are not crazy. They have a logic of things. And it was important for me to be in the head of these people to understand better what they want and also maybe to fight against it better. But it was very risky, very difficult, and I had a lot of contacts since long time. And I made this movie with a friend of mine who is Muslim. I'm not Muslim. He's a Mauritanian journalist living in Paris, and we were working together during the war in Libya. And we decided to go to see these people when they were in Timbuktu, because Timbuktu is a place in north of Mali where the people are speaking French. And in reality, it's not so far from Paris. It's 5 hours by flight. It's less than from LA to New York. So it was important for us to go to see these people, and after that, to see leaders of Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, also to meet some theoreticians, thinkers of Salafism, because I think it's important to know what is in the head of people they decide to make war to the Western world.
Yeah, one of the things that sometimes from the West is an easy thing to believe is that anyone who is willing to commit these horrible acts of terror that take place in many parts of the world, that we can simply say it's mental illness. They're crazy. That's it. But one of the things that I think your film does a good job of exposing is that it without defending anything that they're doing, of course, there's no defense of what they're doing. If you understand the circumstances in which these individuals are living, if you understand the geopolitics and the upbringing and what's taking place in their countries, there's what I would call like an internal logic to how they become radicalized.
Yes, there is a lot of reason of radicalism on terrors, but I think when you give explanation is not enough. If you say, for example, that it's not the same problem, that Hitler had problem with Jews because he was refused as a painter in Vienna when he decided to go to be a painter, is not a good explanation. It's not enough to understand why he decided to kill 6 million of the Jews.
Right.
So the social reason, the political reason, the geopolitical reason, the different reasons like that are not enough to understand what is religious ideology, because it's very different from the other ideology we meet in the last century, on the maybe since 2 or 3 centuries, because it's not a rational ideology. Even the Nazism, even the Red Khmer, even a lot of people who commit massacre everywhere, they have they trust in rationality. And the problem with this type of Muslim, I say very clearly, all the Muslims are not like that. And it's maybe the most important reason I made this movie is to make this distinction between Salafists and other Muslims. It's very important to understand that they are not in the ordinary logic that we know since long time. And it was important for me because it's very simple. It's very easy to think all these people are crazy. But it's not true. It's not true. Some people are rich. You know, the pilot of the jets of September 11, they were from rich family from Saudi. In France, also some terrorists who attacked the Bataclan, they were coming from a not very rich family, but not from poor family. Sometimes there are also poor people inside the terrorists. But it's not enough to understand that. Salafists use a lot of contradiction where they are. They use in Iraq, for example, contradiction between Shia and Sunni. In Mali, they use contradiction between black Africans and the Tuareg, who are Arabs in the north. They use everything to oblige people to come in their ideology. And it was important for me to see these people, because another thing is very specific to Salafists. They don't trust very much in life on earth. They prefer life after the death, in paradise. And it's very complicated with people like that to discuss, and also to convince him to be like other humans. It's very complicated. Really, I know what they have in the head since long time, and it's very specific.
And Francois, how did you convince people to speak to you? Because there are a number of interviews in the film where you get into what are very personal and sensitive topics with individuals who could conceivably be moved to commit violence against you if they perceive your motivations to be not advantageous to them. So how did you convince people to talk to you? What did you tell them that you were doing?
But it was very complicated. I have a relationship with these people, and these people, they are like everybody in the world. They like to speak on TV. It was not exactly TV because it's a film, but they like that because they want to defend their point of view. And with us, it was maybe easier than with other people, because I made a movie, the only movie in Afghanistan at the time of the Taliban when they are at the power. It was in 2000, 1 year before September 11. For them, it was a reference. It was not a film for them. But to be in Afghanistan at this time, it was very important. It was like it was a paradise for them. It's not true. I confirm, but it's like that. Now with internet, it's possible to contact these people because they have address. If they don't want to answer, they don't want to answer. But with us, because I say us, because my friend Lemin Ul Salam is Muslim, is Mauritanian, he has also contact. It was a little more simple than for other people, but a lot of these guys refused to make interview with us. It was we spent 3 years to make this movie, because between 2 interviews, sometimes it was 3 or 4 months to wait. announced world. So it was very complicated, very risky, because when we were in Timbuktu, for example, we were like 1,000 kilometers from the next military place. So I was in the end of these people. If they wanted to kill me or to take me as an hostage, it was very easy for them.
Yeah, and were there circumstances where you were fearing for your own safety? Are there any particular moments where things were not looking particularly good?
Yes, it was very dangerous, but in reality, I'm in conscience of that. I was in the past in Afghanistan of the Taliban. I was with children soldiers in Liberia. We were a drug addict. I hope I'm lucky, but
what precautions do you take? I mean, I understand you're saying you're accustomed to being in these situations because of the work that you've done, but what are some of the precautions that you take that someone who is not experienced in these areas may not know to take?
I don't make, I have no precaution.
Is that right?
I trust in humanity. It's my only way. Maybe it's a big mistake, but a big part of my family was killed in Ukraine and Lithuania during the Shoah by bullets, and I think I try to trust in a new humanity. Maybe I'm making a big mistake, but I want to be optimistic on that.
Well, you made it, so I guess in that sense, your optimism was not completely completely without reason. There was a moment during which this film was banned in France. Is it still banned in France, and can you talk about why that was?
Yes, it was censored integrally at the beginning, and now it's only for people over 18 years old. It's crazy because it's not the problem. But the rules in France are, when a film is forbidden for people under 18, it's impossible to show the movie on the TV. Mm. In reality, the film was co-produced by two very important channels in France, Canal Plus and France Télévisions. And with this interdiction, it was not possible for them to show on TV. And until now, it's not on TV. And I think on TV it will be a very important thing to show this movie. And I hope in the future it will be possible, because what I know about censure, I don't know in English.
Censorship, yeah.
Censorship. It's never for all the time, for the future. It was a lot of films in France. They were censored by François Truffaut, by Chris Marker, by Alain Resnais, by Jean-Luc Godard in the past, by Jean Renoir, just before the Second World War. At the end, now nobody remember this film was censored at this time. So I hope in the future the people will change their mind, because everywhere when I show the film in France, the people were very, I don't know, the word happy is not very good for this film, because it's not a film. Yeah. It's not a feel-good movie. But it's very interesting, and the people were absolutely surprised of this censorship also in France, really.
We've been speaking with French documentarian Francois Margolin, whose latest film, Jihadists, is now available. Francois, thank you so much for talking to me about your film today.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to talk with you, with my Franglish, yes, not real French.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
After a bunch of back and forth, Donald Trump is not going to be giving the State of the Union address on Tuesday, January 29th, in the House of Representatives, and it is absolutely delightful. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has succeeded in explaining to Donald Trump that ultimately it's up to her whether he gives the speech in the House of Representatives or not. And Donald Trump has conceded this. We'll get to his tweets a little bit later, but let me catch you up on the entire back and forth. It started with Nancy Pelosi sending an invitation letter to Donald Trump to come and give the State of the Union address. And this is sort of a formality, but it's also sort of not a formality, because the Speaker of the House does have to invite Trump to speak before a joint session of Congress. The president can't just decide that he is going to speak on the floor of the House of Representatives. The president, I believe, has floor privileges at the U.S. Senate, which means he can get on the floor of the U.S. Senate, but that doesn't mean that he can just choose to speak there if not invited, and certainly he can't choose to speak on the floor of the House of Representatives either. So initially, Nancy Pelosi invited Trump. Then the shutdown happened, and Nancy Pelosi sent a letter sort of suggesting that it be postponed over security concerns because the federal government's partially shut down. These are these special national security events. And we were sort of reading between the lines. She's just saying, if the government's shut down, we're not letting you speak. But at least security was what was cited. And remember that the State of the Union can be given from anywhere. The Constitution says only that it needs to take place from time to time. Often it used to be done in writing. So there's nothing that says it has to be at the House of Representatives. It has to be in January or February. It usually is, but it certainly doesn't have to be. So Donald Trump, I guess, thought he was being brilliant by writing a letter back to Nancy Pelosi saying, I asked about the security. Security is going to be fine, so I still plan on speaking, and sort of calling Nancy Pelosi's bluff. And then Nancy Pelosi just wrote back saying no. She wrote back yesterday saying, I'm writing to inform you that the House of Representatives will not consider a concurrent resolution authorizing the President's State of the Union in the House chamber until the government has reopened. I support her in this. I think that this is great that she's, number one, not letting Donald Trump push her around. Given Trump's views on women and his views on his own sort of alpha male status, he is clearly triggered by potentially not getting his way. He wants to force his way into the House of Representatives, and she's not going to let him do it. And all along this process, he seemed not to understand that it's just not up to him. And now he finally does understand it. He's the president. He doesn't own everything. He's not used to being told no. He's certainly not used to women telling him no. And he doesn't want to seem like a loser, but he is accepting that he is not going to be allowed to give the State of the Union address. And one of the most important reasons, I mean, listen, there are these sort of personality dynamics. We don't want to give Trump the idea that he's in charge of stuff he's not in charge of and all of that. I don't want him spending an hour or an hour and 15 minutes or 45 minutes or however many minutes it is doing a build the wall rally. We just don't need that. OK, we just don't need the State of the Union address at all, really. I mean, government's been shut down for more than a month. We're the world's laughingstock. That's the State of the Union. And Donald Trump has accepted this. Donald Trump taking to Twitter late last night and tweeting, as the shutdown was going on, Nancy Pelosi asked me to give the State of the Union address. I agreed. She then changed her mind because of the shutdown, suggesting a later date. This is her prerogative. That's right. I will do the address when the shutdown is over. I am not looking for an alternative venue for the State of the Union address because there is no venue that can compete with the history, tradition, and importance of the House chamber. I look forward to giving a, quote, great State of the Union address in the near future. Pat, you know that this is not how Donald Trump talks. This is not how Donald Trump behaves. This is a Trump who is pretending to play nice because he's been told by advisors, you can't win this. Stop fighting it. Try to save face. He lost. Nancy Pelosi won. And I say good for her.
Yeah, total surrender here. I thought he would take his ball and go home. I thought maybe he would deliver the address from the Oval Office or just somewhere in the White House, or maybe he would hold a campaign rally and do it there. But no, I guess he wants to wait around, and I think this is the right decision, even if it takes another month or two before the government reopens.
What's also funny about all of this is that anyone who understands how this works knew that Pelosi would win on this one. And in particular, anybody who's been following how Nancy Pelosi hasn't been pushed around, she hasn't been bullied by Donald Trump into reopening government with money for the border wall. She is standing clear and saying, this is your shutdown. We said before we weren't going to give you money for the wall. We are still saying now we're not giving you money for the wall. This is your shutdown and you own it. If we saw her behavior there of not being pushed around, of course she wasn't going to be pushed around into letting Trump speak if she doesn't want him to speak while the shutdown is going on. And, he has this reputation that it's sort of an apocryphal reputation for being a great master negotiator. He seems to have negotiated himself out of his position from yesterday morning to this new one where he's saying Nancy Pelosi wins, Nancy Pelosi gets her way, and we will see how he ultimately negotiates himself out of his own shutdown that was totally optional. I look forward to that. The only downside is now we won't have a State of the Union live stream on Tuesday, which I was sort of looking forward to doing. But I have a feeling before it's all said and done, before the year is out anyway, we will probably get something that we can approximately call a State of the Union address from Donald Trump to analyze. In the middle of this standoff between Donald Trump and Democrats on the government shutdown and on the border wall funding, we now have a situation where we are realizing even the merits of the shutdown don't seem to be galvanizing or coalescing too much support from the voting public. We learned that Donald Trump is not going to be giving his State of the Union address. We learned that at least not yet, we learned that Donald Trump so far has basically issued what is a non-starter in terms of his offer to Democrats to get government reopened. And the next question to ask is, do voters want a border wall so badly that they believe that holding government closed until they get it is worth it? And the answer is no, voters don't want that. And I'm going to go through a bunch of the results from this new Politico Morning Consult poll, which is out. And just about every answer here, just about every data set is very, very damaging to Donald Trump. Let's first start with Donald Trump's approval-disapproval. Trump's disapproval rate, according to the new Politico Morning Consult poll, is 57%. 57% of registered voters now disapprove of the job Trump is doing. 40% approve. Trump's disapproval tied for the highest of any survey during Donald Trump's presidency so far. So number one, that's not looking good. Next question. Who would you say is mostly to blame for the government shutdown? This is the next question from the Politico Morning Consult poll. 49% of registered voters now say that Donald Trump is mostly to blame for the government shutdown. On the one hand, that's shockingly low because he said he would shut it down. He did shut it down, and he is to blame for the shutdown. But the upside to this is that it hasn't really shifted. I was concerned that once Democrats would get sworn into the House, that blame might start shifting to them in the minds of many registered voters. It hasn't happened. 49%, a plurality, still say Trump is mostly to blame for the shutdown. 35% say Democrats. 4% say Republicans. Next question. Do voters see the shutdown in and of itself as a problem? In other words, is the shutdown, aside from the goals of the shutdown, as stated by Trump, is the shutdown itself a problem? 46% of registered voters say that it is a crisis, that the government shutdown is a crisis. 35% believe that the government shutdown is a problem, meaning that in total, 81% of registered voters believe the shutdown in and of itself is a crisis or problem. Not good numbers for Donald Trump. And then lastly, what about the wall? The question, if the only way to end the government shutdown is to dedicate funds for a border wall along the United States-Mexico border, would you support or oppose it? 3% would strongly support border wall funding if it were the only way to end the shutdown. And remember, it's not the only way to end the shutdown. Trump is claiming that's the only way he will be willing to end the shutdown, but it's not. This is a hypothetical. Only 3% would strongly support funding the border wall if it were the only way to end the shutdown. 4% would somewhat support funding the border wall if it were the only way to end the shutdown. So in total, only 7% of Americans either somewhat or strongly support a government shutdown if it's the only way to ultimately get to border wall funding. 13% somewhat oppose it. 59% strongly oppose it. My thought on this, Pat, is that 7% must be really, really active on Twitter because they are an extraordinarily loud 7%.
Yeah, most of these numbers make sense to me. The fact, though, that 46% of Americans identify the shutdown as a crisis and 35% identify it as a problem, that totals 81%. And yet we still have 40% of Americans approving of the president. How does that square up? I thought his base of support was a little bit lower than 40%. I thought it was maybe 30, 35%. They're sticking to him, and that's really upsetting to me.
Yes. There are a lot of bad signs for the president in this poll, but as usual, because of the unilaterally divided American electorate and political support bases, the numbers are also stunningly high in their support for the actions of Donald Trump and in general approval of Donald Trump. And I think that in a Gallup poll, Trump's approval has been trending down since the shutdown started from about, I'm going from memory here, maybe starting around 42%, now down to somewhere in the 36, 37% range, of course, plus or minus a couple of points for margin of error. So if there are any indications that this is a bad political strategy for Trump, he may get the wall funding, he may not. We don't know. I'm hoping he doesn't, and I think it's likely that he won't, but he might. From a political standpoint, Nancy Pelosi's approval rating continues to climb the more she plays tough with Trump and says, you're just not going to get what it is that you want. You're not going to do it. And you don't see particularly strong support for the shutdown as a way to obtain border wall funding. Trump's disapproval rating is up. Every indicator here is that this has completely backfired on Donald Trump, but that should not make us assume that it will have electoral consequences in 2020. We should not even, that shouldn't even enter our minds, because get out the vote and making sure everybody votes is going to be the only way to get this guy out of here. Even with something like a 26% approval rating, if only half the country votes, Trump can win. We've done the math and demonstrated how it's possible for a president with 26% approval to win a presidential reelection campaign. And that is extraordinarily scary. And that's why we need to be making sure that we don't rest on our laurels for any reason, no matter what polling says at any time between now and the 2020 election. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a caller who wants to bet me about something. Take a listen to what they want to bet on.
Hey, David, are you willing to bet, and this, I don't know if you're a betting man, but are you willing to bet one day that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will be president? I'll put $20 in the six-pack on it.
I'm not, no, that's not, I'm not, I don't know if he wants to bet me that she will, and I would bet that she wouldn't, or vice versa. But in any case, I am not a betting man. And in any case, that's not even a gentleman's bet that I could take. I just think it's so early, Pat, to even start speculating about that. I get it. The appeal that she's having on the basis of charisma and personality, it is something. There's no question about it. But I'm not ready to make any bets one way or the other about AOC as a possible future president.
Well, she's only, 28 years old, so she'd have to wait until she was 35. So it would be a while. And even then, you'd think that she would want to wait around until she was in her 40s and 50s and had some experience. But you might as well take the bet, because $20 now, that's a little bit of money. But given, inflation, that may just be peanuts in a couple decades.
Yeah, but that would, then I would also be losing much more than $20 if I lost the bet, right? So I don't know that inflation is, when I'm thinking about making bets, I usually am not thinking about inflation, but that's an interesting approach. We'll maybe delve into more about that on the bonus show today. Speaking of which, we have a great bonus show today. Amazon has started to test deliveries with sidewalk drones. We follow up about the pregnancy of a woman in a vegetative state in a U.S. Care home, as it's called. And we will also talk about new findings regarding body size and longevity split among gender lines. Very interesting bonus show today. I hope you'll join me there as a member or as a patron.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.